We're at a very special time of year, as we're all aware of. This is the time between the days of unleavened bread, Passover unleavened bread, and Pentecost, which has already been mentioned. And you know, God's Word has a great deal to say about this time of year. Basically, I'm not talking about that this Sabbath. Next Sabbath, I'll spend more time with that. But I do want to speak about a subject today that lends itself very well to this time of year, because in the Word of God, we are given examples of people, ordinary people just like us, who God used in very wonderful ways, sometimes in miraculous ways, to carry out His purpose and His will throughout the annals of mankind. We also find that there are many scriptures in God's Word, in the Bible, that are associated with certain aspects of the Jewish religion, but also carry a parallel connection with our understanding of God's plan of salvation that He has laid out for us in our observance of His holy days. And I want to speak about such a person, or actually persons, because there is a connection that we find in the book of Ruth. Now, I know most of you aren't surprised that this is a book that we would be speaking about this time of year. In fact, I just found out recently that I think Mr. Robin Weber gave a sermon in Cincinnati on the book of Ruth, in which he probably stole some of my material, but that'll be all right. I'll let him get by with it. I haven't actually heard it, but you know, Ruth is a wonderful, wonderful book, as hopefully we're going to see today. It's a very short book. It's only 4 chapters long, very easy to read through, which we'll be reading through a good portion of it today. But it's a story about 3 people, basically, 3 characters that are revealed in this book, in this story. And it's actually a saga of tragedy as it starts out that ultimately turns to triumph, which is always a wonderful thing to read through. We find that from the Jewish standpoint, this is a book that is read in Jewish synagogues still to this day at morning services during what they call Shavuot, which is also called Feast of Weeks. Sounds familiar to all of us, I'm sure. It takes place 7 weeks after the weekly Sabbath following the Passover. And we, of course, as it's shown in the New Testament, is Pentecost. So it's very appropriate for us to look at the book of Ruth during this time. As we move through the message today, I would like for you to think about why the book of Ruth is important for us to understand. Why we would take a Sabbath service to read through this story. Also think about how this story might relate to you personally. Because it can and does relate to each of us individually in different ways, because we are each going through this life and dealing with things at different times in different ways. But we find that in this book, it's a book of maybe simple lessons, if you would, that are played out by simple people that produce profound healing in their personal lives. Healing that all of us find ourselves in need of at different times as we go through this life. Now, you'll have to excuse me a little bit. When I got down to our house yesterday, the screened-in deck was literally covered with pollen from the trees coming out. So I immediately took my vacuum and stuff and went out there and started cleaning and didn't put a mask on. And so I'm kind of dealing with it today. So I apologize if I have to sniffle a little bit as I go through this. But you know, all of us deal with life sometimes where we look at where we are and we realize that life just hasn't quite worked out the way we thought it would in the beginning. It doesn't matter what our background has been. Never doesn't matter what experiences we've had. We all face times of doubt, times of spiritual drought, if you would, even times of fear with what lies ahead for each of us individually. And as we go through this book today, I want us to think about these people and their lives and how our lives can relate to them. You see, the book of Ruth can provide us with a guide, if you would, to help us as we go through our lives. So as we look at Ruth, consider how these experiences revealed in her story, in their story, relates to our personal lives. Now, in the book of Ruth, we see demonstrated one thing of many things, and we will not be able to cover everything in this little book today, believe me. But we see demonstrated the power of effective closure on what may have transpired in our lives in the past. That's something that sometimes troubles a lot of us when we have not successfully closed the door on our past. Each and every one of us, we have a story in our lives. Each and every one of us has a past that, for some reason, we may still be dealing with. Maybe we even think that somehow God hasn't been quite fair with how things have worked out for us. Maybe we feel that God has or does not care what may be happening to us. Maybe we've been hurt by other people, and the pain of that still nags at us to this day as a result of that hurt. And the question that we often deal with and struggle with is why? Why did this happen in the way it did? Well, maybe as we look at the situation with Ruth, it will help us realize that we are able to, as Ruth did, go forward in our lives in faith and confidence that we no longer will let our past hold us back. We want us to realize that we can have an abiding, abounding, and growing faith that God has a presence in our life. It's interesting as you study through Ruth and study the various writings on Ruth, and there are quite a few books have been written about the book of Ruth. We have one at home. It's not a very large book, but it is so interesting to read through other people's thoughts and ideas about what we learn from the book of Ruth. And to be honest with you, most of it is very right on, spot on. But it's interesting that there's so much in this book that relates to the spring festivals that we observe. Notice one simple parallel from the book of Ruth that we will see. We have the story in this book of putting off the old woman of Moab and then walking new in faith in a new land and coming up on a Savior in the form of a man named Boaz, a man that she did not know about before, a man that she did not understand, but as she came to see was rock solid and was there to save and redeem her. So we see in this story of Ruth, in so many ways, it actually pictures the spring festival days that we observe. And those of you that have observed God's holy days for years can easily see this parallel. And it will easily come to your mind as we go through this. Now, it's important when you read through the story of people in God's Word, especially in the Old Testament, that you get the context of the culture, the climate in which this book is written. And we want to do that with Ruth. But what we want to do is to go back to the previous book in the Bible, and that is the book of Judges, because it's believed that Ruth was written by Samuel. It's believed that Samuel also wrote Judges. So if you go to Judges, the last chapter, chapter 21, and let's just notice the last verse in chapter 21, verse 25. It says, "In those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes." So this is the culture, if you would, in which Ruth is written. Because Samuel continues or fills in the rest of the story in the book of Ruth about a very real people with very real problems who worship a very real God. A people who stand out in an otherwise discouraging, antagonistic time. You see, during the time of Ruth, if I could put it this way, being a Christian was not easy. Remember, everybody religiously and in their religious observances was basically doing what they wanted to do. So, true followers of God who strive to live in obedience to His law, they were there among a culture and a nation that was basically anti-God, true God. So it wasn't easy to live in obedience to God. And I think we can understand that in our culture today. It's getting more and more difficult to live in obedience to God, surrounded by the godless world in which we live. So let's capture the setting for this story for just a moment. This is during the spring harvest season that it mentions, as we will see when it talks about the barley fields being harvested. It's a time of first fruits. You might say, and as we go through this, it's the season of time that we are in right now. We are in that time. It's this period of time that the book of Ruth takes place. It's a story that, as I said, basically has three main characters: Ruth, Naomi, and Boaz. These are three unlikely characters, if you would, that God has recorded their life, or this portion of their life, for one purpose, and that is for you and I to learn lessons from what they experienced. One of these three is a woman that was basically marginalized through the death of her husband, and she's now a widow. Another woman who is living in a patriarchal society in a land away from her own people, or that's what the Naomi was. The other woman is a younger woman, but she's a Gentile. She's a foreigner. And then we have the man Boaz, whose mother was none other than Rahab. You remember Rahab, who was the woman that hid the two spies that Joshua sent into Jericho to see the strength of the city. Now, it's interesting, as most of us have always understood and believed, that Rahab was a prostitute. In fact, she is called a harlot there in Joshua 2. But you know, many commentators believe that Rahab was not really a prostitute, but instead she ran a boarding house that catered to many people coming in and out of the city who needed accommodations for a short period of time. Now, we may not know for a fact that is the case, but it seems to make sense because, remember, these were spies. They didn't want to be seen or recognized, so going to a boarding house to stay would not draw attention to them, because strangers coming into the city would naturally go to that boarding house to rent a room for a night or a day or a week. So it could be, but that's just a side point. What is important to glean from the book of Ruth, or another thing, is that God can and will use anyone who is open to Him and open to His purposes. It's a lesson that as we go through Ruth, we can't let go past us without thinking about. So let's begin looking at this wonderful story that is preserved, as I said, for you and I to learn from. Now we're going to read a lot of this book, and I'll try to summarize some of it for the sake of time. You find at the beginning of Ruth that there is a famine in the land of Judah. Not an unusual circumstance in biblical times. Remember, this was an agrarian society. When there was no rain, you had famine, because they didn't have grocery stores that you could go down and buy the food. So they were totally dependent on God's mercy and God's blessings with the weather. But you find there was a famine, and there's a man named Elimelech, took his wife and 2 sons, and he moved to the land of Moab. Apparently the drought was not, and the famine wasn't as severe in Moab. So right off we see at the very beginning of this book a valuable lesson for you and I to contemplate. That is that God will often use adversity to test His servants, to move them into new environments, to move them into new situations. And He does this not so they can fail, but so they can grow. And we see that time and time again with God's people. We find in a course of time, Elimelech dies, leaving Naomi with her 2 sons. Her 2 sons eventually married women of Moab. And it says here that Naomi and her sons lived in Moab for 10 years. At least 10 years. I think probably she was there longer than that. Then her 2 sons die, leaving Naomi and 2 foreign-born daughter-in-laws alone. Now we have 3 women in a society that was anything but kind with regard to women, especially women left on their own. So, what were they to do? Well, let's drop down to verse 6 and verse 7. Then she arose, this is Naomi, and her daughters-in-law, that she might return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had visited His people by giving them bread. So the famine in Judah had lifted. Things were better there. Therefore she went out from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. So they decided to leave and go back to Judah. And her daughters-in-law were going with her. But notice what the phrase is used here in verse 7, which I find very interesting. It says, therefore, every time you and I read that term, that phraseology in the Bible, again we should stop and consider what God is about to tell us. It says, therefore, she went out from the place where she was. Now, what is interesting here, the words seem to indicate like God called Naomi out of where she was, and it says she went. Now, where else in your thinking do you remember similar things happening to someone that God was going to use? Abraham. Remember when God called Abraham, and this happened nearly 500 years before this time, it says of Abraham that he went. He went, he left his homeland, he left the surroundings that he was familiar with, and he became a pilgrim and sojourner in a foreign land. Well, in the same way, Naomi and Ruth are about to embark on their journey of faith, just as Abraham did. They were about to leave everything that they had known for many years. They did not know what lay ahead of them. But it says she went. She went with her 2 daughters-in-law. Verse 8, and Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go, return each to her mother's house. The Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband. So she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So Naomi urges her 2 daughters-in-law to go back to their own families. Remember, here's 3 women with no husband, no father to watch over them and care for them, to provide for them. So Naomi, out of concern for her daughters-in-law, urges them to go back to their own families, but they both lifted up their voices and wept. In other words, they didn't want to leave her. They wanted to stay with her. Verse 10, and they said to her, surely we will return with you to your people. But Naomi said, turn back, my daughters. Why would you go with me? Are there still sons in my womb that you may be your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, if I should have a husband tonight and should also bear sons, would you wait for them till they were grown? Would you restrain yourselves from having husbands? No, my daughters, for it grieves me very much for your sakes that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me. So we see that 3 times Naomi urged them to return to their families. Again, look, we have 3 women all alone. Unknown future, having no idea what was going to happen to them. So she urges them to leave and go back to their family. Now, why would they refuse to leave Naomi? Well, Naomi's name tells us a lot, because Naomi means pleasant one. We can surmise that Naomi was of such character that she was admired and loved by these 2 girls so much that, and of course, I think had been a wonderful example to them, that they just couldn't imagine leaving her and not being with her. It says that Naomi was grieving. Now, we've all grieved at times when we've lost someone, but think about Naomi. She had lost her husband and her 2 sons, all within a reasonably short period of time. So it's fully understandable why she would be in this state of mind and why she was grieving in her heart. You see, she didn't have all the answers at this time. She knew there was a God, but she doesn't really understand what God is doing. And of course, that's perfectly all right. Because we know God's ways are not our ways. God's thoughts are not our thoughts. So at times we can wonder why God is allowing things to work out the way they are. It's not wrong to think that way, as Naomi did. But let's notice what happens in verse 14. Because here is a crucial point that we don't want to miss in this story of Naomi and Ruth. Verse 14. Then they lifted up their voices, now this is the 2 daughters-in-law, and wept again. And Orpah, this is the other daughter-in-law besides Ruth, kissed her mother-in-law, which means she succumbed to Naomi's insistence that she go back to her family, and she left. She kissed her goodbye and she went back to her family. But notice what it says about Ruth. It says Ruth clung to her. Ruth clung to her. Verse 15 it says, and she said, Naomi said to Ruth, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. Now, there's something fascinating here about Ruth. Ruth, who is going to be in the line of David, who is going to be in the line of Jesus Christ. That's why this story of Ruth should be of great interest to you and I. Something wonderful is transpiring here as revealed in these simple words, but Ruth clung to her. We're going to see what that means. How about the other daughter-in-law who went back to her family? Was she a bad person? Did she do something wrong by going back to her family? No, she didn't do anything wrong. It's just that Ruth made a better choice. The lesson for you and I is simply this. You and I also have choices to be made. It's the same choice that we see men and women of faith have had to make down through the ages. It's the same choice that you and I have to make daily in our lives. So, somewhere on the road between Moab and Bethlehem, Ruth made her choice to follow the way of God. The same choice that you and I have made. There was no return for Ruth after she had made this choice. She was putting her hand to the plow, and there was no going back to the past. Then down in verse 16 and 17, we read what is called the Song of Ruth. But Ruth said, "Entreat me not to leave you," speaking to Naomi, "or to turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go, and wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me." There is so much symbolism in these few words that Ruth said to Naomi. Even with her young husband recently dead, even with the chance to go back to her own family, Ruth is abandoning her past. She is fully clinging to this new family of Naomi. And she is saying, "I will be buried with your family. I'm giving up on my former life. I'm giving up on my life in Moab. I'm giving up on the old world, the old ways." Life had not been fair from a human standpoint to Ruth. But Ruth was willing to step out with Naomi. She was stepping out on faith. When you go through the commentaries and read about this book of Ruth, it seems that when she said, "Your God will be my God," she did not use the term Elohim for God, which normally would be the term that foreigners would use in talking about the great God. Instead, she used the term Yahweh, which indicates a personal God. It indicates a personal relationship with this God that she was choosing to follow. Ruth had chosen to have that personal relationship. She had chosen to walk in this new way of life that she had not known before. Verse 18 is an interesting verse. When Naomi saw that Ruth was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking to her. Now, that doesn't mean that she was mad at her or quit talking to her. It just means that Naomi realized now that Ruth was resolved to do what she wanted to do, and nothing that Naomi could say was going to deter her from following the way of God. That's the way we all want to be. So they traveled, came back to the city of Bethlehem, and the city was excited to see Naomi return. It says that the women said and questioned, "Is this Naomi?" Remember, she had been gone for a minimum of 10 years. They probably didn't even know she was still alive. So they were excited to see her and hear of her. Go down to verse 20. Notice what Naomi said to these women. "But she said to them, 'Do not call me Naomi,'" remember, which means pleasant, "but call me Mara," which means bitter. "For the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me." Verse 21, "I went out full, and the Lord has brought me home again empty. Why do you call me Naomi, since the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has afflicted me?" I think we can all relate to this attitude, if you would, or this way Naomi felt. You see, her life had been turned completely upside down. She had lost her husband and her sons. She lived through some very trying and traumatic times in her life. And she was being very honest at this time with her feelings. She was being very honest with her daughter-in-law. She was being very honest with God. Perhaps we see in Naomi the need for us to be more honest with one another. And I don't mean sharing just our joys and great times in our lives, but at times sharing what would be perceived as unedited, unabridged thoughts and commentaries on where we are actually in our personal lives. Those times when life becomes extremely hard, when we need strength and support from our fellow laborers in the faith. You see, God could use other people sometimes to help bring us back and strengthen our relationship with Him. So we have to ask ourselves as we think about this interaction with Naomi and Ruth and the other women and men of the city, are we willing to allow God to use us in such a powerful way as we see happening here in the lives of these people? See, God used Naomi to help Ruth come through the troubles of Moab. And now we're going to see He is going to use Ruth to help Naomi come back from the bitterness, to come out of the sorrow that she now found herself engulfed by. Verse 22. So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. Now they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So this takes place right after Passover and unleavened bread. That's the time in which this is transpiring. Then we move on to chapter 2. Now we have the man Boaz entering the story. In verse 1 we see that we are told that Boaz was a wealthy man. He was also a relative, a family relative of Elimelech, which is very interesting and which comes into play here in just a moment. So he was a relative, Naomi's late husband. So as the story unfolds with Boaz, something very important comes out about this man that I want us to see very quickly. Not only was he a wealthy man, as far as his material possessions in this world, but more importantly, Boaz was a man who was rich in integrity and compassion. That's qualities that all of God's people should be striving to emulate. Verse 3, talking about Ruth, then she left and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers, and she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz. Now, in human terms, she just happened to come to this field. But as you go through this story, this just didn't happen by coincidence. This was all by design from the great God. And it says, field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. Now remember, she did not know this. She had no clue who Boaz was or anything about him. Verse 4, and behold, Boaz came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, now don't miss this. Boaz said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. These are men that worked for Boaz. What was their response to their boss? And they answered him, the Lord bless you. Can you glean the relationship that Boaz had with his workers? They had tremendous respect for this man, and he had respect for them. A great, great example that all of us should try to follow. Verse 5. Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "Whose young woman is this?" Talking about Ruth. Again, he had no clue who this woman was. So the servant who was in charge of the reapers answered and said, "It is a young Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." And she said, Ruth said, "Please let me glean and gather after the reapers among the sheaves." So she came and has continued from morning until now, though she has rested a little in the house. Then Boaz said to Ruth, "You will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go to glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women. Let your eyes be on the field which they reap, and go after them. Have I not commanded the young men not to touch you? And when you are thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn." So she fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" She was not of the land of Judah. She was not an Israelite. Verse 11, And Boaz answered and said to her, "It has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, and how you have left your father and your mother and the land of your birth, and have come to a people whom you did not know before." Boaz understood the sacrifice that this young woman was making. So many lessons we could learn from this. But remember, at this time, in this culture in Israel, every man was doing that which was right in his own eyes. Not everybody was upholding the laws of God. Not everybody was setting aside a portion of their fields for the poor and the homeless. God had commanded, you can read about it back in Leviticus 9, that the people should not reap the corners of the fields, nor gather the gleanings, which was that portion of the grain that would fall to the ground. You see, these were to be left very obviously in the fields for the poor and the stranger of the land to go in and gather those for themselves. It was made available to the poor, but they had to go forth and put forth the effort. In other words, they had to work to gather it for themselves. But it was to be left for them. You see, Boaz was a man not only of faith, he was a man who kept the law of God. And by Boaz keeping of these laws, it was the means by which Ruth was able to participate and come into contact with these laws of God. In other words, he exemplified obedience to the law of God. Chapter 2, verse 12. "The Lord repay your work, and a full reward be given to you by the Lord God of Israel." Notice what Boaz says to her. "Under whose wings you have come for refuge." Can you imagine again the situation that Ruth was in? How encouraging these words of hope were to her. Spoken by a faithful servant of God. Spoken to this young woman who had given up the gods of Moab and was coming to believe, coming into a relationship with Yahweh. You can only imagine how they strengthened her belief in the God of Israel. Her blessing was not only that she had come into the barley field of a godly man, but she was coming under the wings of God, the God who Boaz worshipped. Verse 13, "Then she said, 'Let me find favor in your sight, my Lord, for you have comforted me, and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not one of your maidservants.' Now Boaz said to her at mealtime, 'Come here and eat of the bread, and dip your piece of bread in the vinegar.' So she sat aside beside the reapers, and he passed parched grain to her, and she ate and was satisfied." And notice this wonderful example. She kept some back. She kept some back. We're going to see what that means. This is some of the food that they had given her. Verse 15. And when she rose up to glean, Boaz commanded his young men, saying, let her glean even among the sheaves, and do not reproach her. So he was showing special favor to this young woman. And let grain from the bundles fall purposely for her. Wonder who was inspiring this. Leave it, that she may glean, and do not rebuke her. Verse 16 or 17. So she gleaned in the field until evening, and beat out what she had gleaned, and it was an ephah of barley. Then she took it up, went into the city, and her mother-in-law saw what she had gleaned. So she brought out and gave to her, notice, what she had kept back after she had been satisfied. So she brought food to Naomi. Again, here was a young woman who had nothing in this world. She was among the poorest of the poor. Yet we see she had a heart filled with the desire to give and share with someone else. You see, Ruth was living Philippians 2:4. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. So Naomi asked Ruth where she had gleaned that day, and Ruth told her that she had gleaned in the field of a man named Boaz. Again, she didn't know who this was. So Naomi tells her that he is a close relative. Now, the point that most of you may understand is that in the culture of Israel at this time, if a person had suffered loss, the closest relative of that person, who had the capacity and was qualified, could redeem the relative who had suffered the loss. He was obligated to redeem that person to help the poor relative in such a state. We use the term kinsman redeemer to describe such a relative in order to convey this idea that this person was a combination of a human relationship with a divinely appointed role of redeemer. The expression kinsman redeemer is often used to convey that idea. So when we think about that concept, we see Boaz as a type of whom? Jesus Christ. That is what Boaz as a type was. Jesus Christ, who is our Redeemer, who has rescued us from our spiritual poverty. It's quite a picture when you spend time thinking about it. Let's continue on here in verse 22. And Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it is good, my daughter, that you go out with his young women, and that your people do not meet or do not see you in other fields. So she stayed close by the young women of Boaz to glean until the end of the barley harvest and wheat harvest, and she dwelt with her mother-in-law. Remember the time in which this is taking place in Israel. The time of the first fruits. The first fruits of God that are being exemplified by these three individuals, Naomi, Ruth, and Boaz. These were people whose hearts were filled with the goodness of God. People who show a heart of love and compassion, and the actions that love and compassion motivated in their lives. A people of integrity and compassion, whose reputation went before them. Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. Then Naomi, her mother-in-law, said to her, my daughter, shall I not seek security for you, that it may be well with you? Again, Naomi's concern she is showing for her daughter-in-law. Now Boaz, whose young women you were with, is he not our relative? Is he not our kinsman redeemer? In fact, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Therefore, wash yourself, anoint yourself, put on your best garment, and go down to the threshing floor. But do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. So stay inconspicuous. Don't let him know you're there. Then it shall be when he lies down that you shall notice the place where he lies, and you shall go in and cover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what you should do. Now remember, it's pitch dark. There's no lights. So they're all laying around on mats or whatever. So she has to notice where Boaz lays down to sleep that night. And she said to her, all that you say I will do. So she went down to the threshing floor and did according to what her mother-in-law instructed her. And after Boaz had eaten and drunk, and his heart was cheerful, he went to lie down at the end of the heap of grain. And she came softly and covered his feet and lay down. Now it happened at midnight that the man was startled, and he turned himself, and there a woman was lying at his feet. Startled probably would be a correct way to look at that. And he said, who are you? He didn't know who this was. It was dark. He couldn't see. So she answered, I am Ruth, your maidservant. Take your maidservant under your wing, for you are a close relative or a kinsman redeemer. Now, people read this and they think there's some kind of hanky-panky going on here or some kind of illicit sexual stuff, and that's not the case at all. Remember, we are in times when they were living under the laws that God had given to Israel. Under that law, when a woman's husband died, God had given the law that the closest next of kin would honor their family member by taking his wife to be their wife, by bringing her into his own family. They did that to ensure that the name of that deceased husband would not leave the land of Israel. If they had children, then that child would not take the name of that man, but would take the name of the deceased husband. That name then would be carried on in the line in the land of Israel. So what we see happening in reality here is Ruth is submissively at the feet of Boaz. She willingly and voluntarily submits herself into this position, one of submission. So Boaz stretches his garment or his cloak over her. Remember the symbolism that we're looking at here. It's quite revealing. Remember, Boaz had said to her, you have come under the wings of God for refuge. That's what's symbolized by him putting his cloak over her. She was now under the refuge of Boaz. And I'll guarantee you, or I would think Boaz didn't understand, that he was being used by God to bring her into this position of being under the wings of God. This was her refuge. And he probably didn't recognize that at the time. You see, God uses people to serve people. He uses people to help people. He uses people to manifest His will for other people. We're all instruments. And this is what's occurring right here in the book of Ruth. Notice verse 11. And now, my daughter, do not fear. I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman. That alone tells us there was nothing illicit going on here at all. She was a virtuous woman. She was just showing her submission to this kinsman redeemer that Boaz was. Verse 12. Now it is true, and again, remember the character of Boaz. Now it is true that I am a close relative. However, there is a relative closer than I. So he realized that he wasn't the closest relative to Naomi, that there was a relative closer than him. Again, the character of Boaz comes shining through here. He could have taken advantage of the situation. But remember, he obeyed the laws of God to the letter. Verse 13. Stay this night, and in the morning it shall be that if he will perform the duty of a close relative for you, good. Let him do it. But if he does not want to perform the duty for you, then I will perform the duty for you. As the Lord lives, lie down until morning. So he was very open that if your closest relative does not want to redeem this, then I will do so. Boaz was showing himself to be a very honorable man who respected God's laws. Let's drop down to verse 18. So she goes back and she reports to Naomi what has transpired. Naomi said, "Sit still, my daughter, until you know how this matter will turn out. For the man," speaking of Boaz, "will not rest until he has concluded the matter this day." Again, many times God is telling us in our situations to stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. You see, Naomi understood and knew the character of Boaz. And she knew that he would not rest until this matter was settled, but it was going to be settled according to the law of God. Verse 4. Now Boaz went up to the gate and sat down there, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz had spoken came by. So Boaz said, "Come aside, friend, sit down here." So he came and sat down. In verse 2, and he took the 10 men of the elders of the city and said, "Sit down here." So they sat down. So he wanted witnesses to verify what transpired here. Then he said to the close relative, "Naomi, who has come back from the country of Moab, sold the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. And I thought to inform you, saying, buy it back in the presence of the inhabitants and the elders of my people. If you will redeem it, redeem it. But if you will not redeem it, then tell me that I may know, for there is no one but you to redeem it, and I am next after you." And he said, "I will redeem it." Then Boaz said, "On the day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi, you must also buy it from Ruth the Moabitess, the wife of the dead, to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance." Again, that was the law that God had given Israel. Verse 6, and the close relative said, "I cannot redeem it for myself, lest I ruin my own inheritance. You redeem my right of redemption for yourself, for I cannot redeem it." Now this was the custom in former times in Israel concerning redeeming and exchanging. To confirm anything, one man took off his sandal and gave it to the other, and this was a confirmation in Israel. Therefore the close relative said to Boaz, "Buy it for yourself." So he took off his sandal. And Boaz said to the elders and all the people, "You are witness this day that I have bought all that is Elimelech's, and all that is Chilion's and Mahlon's," that was the 2 sons, "from the hand of Naomi. Moreover, the Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position at the gate. You are witnesses this day." So all of this was done in accordance with the law of God. Now, let me share with you one other thought that was brought out about this other kinsman redeemer that refused to to redeem the property and Ruth back from Naomi. What can we say about this man? What can we learn from his example? We don't know who he was. We're not given any names at all. But you see, when this was first presented to him, he saw it to his advantage to acquire more property from Naomi. I mean, that's a pretty good deal, you know. He probably got it for a song and a dance. But when Ruth was thrown into the deal, the bet was off. He saw no personal gain here for himself. There's no gain by marrying a foreigner, he thought. There's no gain for him by marrying a Gentile, by marrying one who was outside the camp. She was going to bring nothing to the relationship. In his mind, he would be on the losing end of that proposition. But Boaz, on the other hand, he accepted the circumstances lovingly. because he was a man of compassion. He's a man that kept the law of God. He's a man of integrity. Again, he is a type of Jesus Christ. You see, Jesus Christ did not desire us for what any of us have. We have nothing, absolutely nothing we could bring to that relationship. We were outside the land. We were, in a sense, dead. But Christ came along, and he said to the Father, I know they're nothing. I know they're not part of our family. I know they've been outside the camp. But I am willing to have my sacrifice cover them, to redeem them, and I'm not worried about losing anything. And we know that Jesus Christ did lose everything. He gave up everything he had with the Father. He came to this earth as a man to prepare us as his bride by redeeming us and giving us opportunity to enter into his eternal family as his wife. And he did it all for the joy that was set before him. What a wonderful example that this story is of our lives for us to learn from. It's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful message. Wonderful people. Little people of and by themselves who served a purpose, a great purpose, for what was to come in the future. We have to ask ourselves as we study and think about their lives and what they went through, are we prepared when opportunity comes our way to glorify God in what we do? Something we should think about often. Understand that at times God is testing us. God is wanting to know if we will look beyond the moment. Look beyond the personal loss that we may have at times. But look for the greater good. Look for the glory of God's kingdom. Now we know at the end of the story here that Naomi was again happy. She had a little baby on her lap. She served as a nurse to a little guy named Obed. Obed, whose son would be Jesse, whose son would be David. You see, God isn't a God who's confined to the moment. Because eventually, after David, his great son was none other than Jesus Christ. Did I get enough great sons in there? I don't know, but anyway, Jesus Christ was in this line. You see, again, God is not confined to the here and now. We not only have a loving God, but we have a God that has had a wonderful plan of salvation from before the beginning. And He is a God who is working His plan. And nothing is going to keep that plan from being fulfilled. And yes, God uses ordinary individuals to carry forth that plan. Sometimes in truly miraculous ways, as He did with Naomi and Ruth. These were women all of us can learn so much from. Women who exhibited the qualities of integrity, compassion, tenacity, hard work, and honor. Qualities we see multiplied 100-fold in the life and character of their future kinsman redeemer, Jesus Christ.